Yes, I mean, funny enough, that no one sits in the phone. Live streaming, we're live. We're on YouTube. Yeah, well, I'm not going to poll and PewDiePie, that's the one.
We are live streaming.
Cross. That's not awkward, is it?
It's fine.
Oh, yeah. Thanks very much, James. It's cycling automatically. It's cycling automatically, yeah. Good man. Anyone tuning in at this particular moment is going to be thrilled.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you all for joining us for another Sheffield Modern International History Group talk. This week we've got Molly Arbuthnot, who is presenting a paper entitled Propaganda in the Periphery, Posters for the 1926 Election Campaign in Soviet Uzbekistan. And Molly is a PhD candidate in Russian and East European Studies at the University of Manchester in the same year as I am, which is the third year, so staring the end of the face. Her thesis is entitled Identity and the Image in Soviet Central Asia, 1920 to 1940, and examines propaganda images in the context of Soviet nationalities policy and contemporaneous theories about national identity and visual propaganda. And previously she studied at the Courtauld Institute of Art and the University of Cambridge. So I'll hand over to Molly now.
Thank you very much.
I see it now through the path of the camera.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for coming. So to start just by introducing myself and my research. So as Liam said, I'm based at the University of Manchester, and I'm looking really at visual culture in Central Asia in the early Soviet period. I'm especially interested in sort of official state art and the way that national and political identities can be visualized. So how do you represent concepts like nationhood, modernity, statehood in visual form? These questions are particularly interesting in the context of Soviet Central Asia, I think, because in the decades following the revolution, these are all highly contested ideas in this region. The Bolsheviks essentially reconquered the former colonies of the Russian Empire following the revolution, and began a new state-building project with grand ideological ambitions, as I'm sure you're all aware, nothing short of the wholesale reconstruction of society. And at the same time, the local elites in Uzbekistan were divided into a number of factions, but they included a significant movement among the sort of modernizing intelligentsia, who either took Soviet promises of national self-determination at face value, or at the very least saw the Soviet state as sort of providing the opportunity to advance their own social reforms according to their own agenda. So in conditions of significant social and political upheaval, there are a number of competing narratives of nationhood and identity and belonging. It's also a region in which the category of nation was relatively new, so the images that we're going to look at today are, to a certain extent, sort of creating a visual language almost from scratch to depict the peoples of the region in a way that reinforced Soviet ideas about identity. And generally speaking, I feel like the question of how nationality is visualized often gets neglected. Recent scholarship pretty much takes for granted the argument that the concept of nationhood is constructed, it's articulated in shared narratives, but the role of the visual rarely attracts as much attention as the textual in this process. And for this reason, amongst others, I think that the visual culture of this period provides a really interesting case study, not just in mobilizational propaganda, but also in the process of imagining communities, to borrow from Benedict Anderson, so depicting national identity in visual form, and also more broadly the function of visual art in colonial and post-colonial space. I'd like to begin with a brief overview of Soviet cultural policy in the 20s in relation to Central Asia. Then I want to talk a little bit about the specific context of the 1926 campaign, and then focus in on the posters themselves. So the region that we're talking about is there. You can see Bukhara is in orange at the bottom. And while I have been referring to it as Uzbekistan for the sake of convenience, that's slightly anachronistic and potentially misleading, but we can get into that later. It largely encompasses what had been the colony of Turkestan and the protectorates of Khwarezm and Bukhara under the Russian Empire. This was relatively recently colonized space and still something of a frontier territory. It was conquered by the Tsarist army in the late 19th century, but not settled by Russians in particularly large numbers and not really very well integrated into the infrastructure of the empire. And then following the October Revolution, the civil war swept across the region, and the connections between Central Asia generally and Petrograd are incredibly weak. The whole region is effectively cut off from events in the Russian metropole for a number of years. So come the early 1920s, the main challenge for the Bolshevik leadership is to re-establish central control in Turkestan and bring sort of Soviet order to it. I haven't really time to enter into the details of the civil war, and lots of very sort of short-lived independent states popped up and collapsed in that time. But suffice to say that this was a period of huge upheaval and economic devastation. Cotton cultivation, which is the main crop in this region, completely collapsed. Irrigation networks were in ruin, which obviously has a huge impact on agriculture. Whole districts were depopulated, and actually fighting continued between Soviet forces and the so-called Basmachi, kind of rebel groups, well into the 1920s, so well beyond the period that the sort of Russian Civil War is considered to have ended. In administrative terms, up until 1924, Turkestan was a semi-autonomous region within the Russian Soviet Republic. So it's nominally under direct control from Moscow, but if in practice this control was fairly patchy. And then in 1924, the Soviet central authorities initiated what they called national delimitation. So that resulted in the whole of the Soviet territory being carved up into 6, to start with, nominally autonomous national republics. And the Uzbek Republic was one of these, encompassing the territory that you can see in this map. So Uzbekistan as such didn't exist until 1924, when it was created as the Uzbek Socialist Republic. It's effectively an administrative region created by the Central Soviet authorities. The 1924 borders also don't match the current borders of the country of Uzbekistan, but that's another story. But before 1924, and indeed afterwards, the people who lived in this region might have described themselves as Uzbek, some of them did, but they may equally have called themselves Turki or Turkic, i.e. speaking a Turkic language, which implies connections with the other Turkic-speaking people in the Russian Empire, such as the Tatars, with whom they shared a written language at this period and exchanged a huge amount of literature. But they more commonly might have identified themselves by their religion, which is predominantly Islam in this region, but there were also significant Jewish and Christian communities. They might have identified themselves by their town or region, such as Bukharan or Akhivan, or by language, or by lifestyle, sort of urban versus rural versus nomadic, etc. This complexity was all much to the frustration of the Russian ethnographers who turned up and were tasked with sorting it all out, basically, this mishmash of identities, in order to draw the borders of the new republics along national lines. Because most people didn't really identify with a recognizable nationality in European terms. Some members of the intelligentsia, though, who were quite well educated and had access to European concepts of the nation state, had been arguing for an Uzbek or a Turkic nation even long before the revolution. And so it's possible to see national delimitation in 1924 as the Soviet state reinforcing a national idea as articulated by Uzbek-speaking elites. What's most relevant to us here in talking about visual art in this period is that the Central Soviet authorities were in a slow process of strengthening their control over state and party organizations in Turkestan and the Uzbek SSR, which engaged in propaganda on a grand scale. Because this is not just about administrative control, but the complete Sovietization of society. The ambitions of the Soviet state obviously were nothing short of utopian. They were aiming to remake the world, to banish exploitation, to put power in the hands of the oppressed. This required, ideologically speaking, organizing society along class lines, enforcing the dictatorship of the proletariat, and destroying the hegemony of the exploiting classes. It also entailed making the beneficiaries of the revolution see the world differently, to see things according to Marxist-Leninist categories. So to see inequality as class exploitation, to identify with class as a sort of fundamental category, and to see things according to Soviet ideology, essentially, and to devote themselves to the revolutionary struggle as the path to salvation. The Soviet project was, in many ways, an exercise in mass mobilization. It demanded active participation in state projects, as well as professed commitment to its ideals. And the party, the Communist Party, saw itself as the guide to this salvation. It had no qualms at all about forcing its vision of liberation on people, whether people understood it or wanted it or not. It's important to note, though, that this was not just sort of Russian imperialism under a different name, for a number of reasons, I think. For starters, that kind of mobilizational project to transform society was never something that the Tsarist state was really interested in. And actually, none of the traditional colonial empires bothered with that kind of mass mobilization. It's much more comparable to the radical modernist states that appeared in the aftermath of the First World War, such as Kemalist Turkey is a really interesting comparative example, and sort of later in the 20th century in Europe, there are a few examples of this sort of political project, each different in different ways, obviously. Secondly, Soviet nationalities policy was self-consciously anti-colonial. And much of their efforts in the 1920s went into dismantling the legacies of empire. There are ways in which you can see it as a sort of proto-post-colonial state. This effort to dismantle the legacies of empire was not necessarily that successful, but they tried in various ways. And the ideological justification for this was that while class, in Marxist terms, was not really a visible category in Central Asia, there just wasn't an urban proletariat that the party could claim to be speaking for. It didn't exist. The Bolsheviks therefore came to see nationality as a sort of surrogate for class. That is, so while the party could be the vanguard of proletarian revolution in Petrograd, it could see itself as the vanguard of a national anti-colonial revolution in the former colonies of the Russian Empire. Leading these, they were sort of officially termed formerly oppressed people, to throw off the shackles of imperialism and to oppose the weight of international capital. In addition, nationhood was defined as a necessary step on the path to socialism. So it's not just that they promoted national consciousness in these regions as sort of anti-Tsarist, but also actually as a positive force to mobilize people in the right direction, as it were. It was accepted that nations were a product of the capitalist age, that societies had to pass through on the transition from feudalism into the socialist future. And then nations, much like the rest of the bourgeois state, would inevitably wither away. The authorities therefore came up with the idea that by creating national republics and giving them the trappings of the nation state, such as national language, culture, and governing elites, it could accelerate the process of transformation. One of the ways they tried to achieve this was the program called Korenizatsiya, which is usually translated as indigenization, which was inaugurated in 1923. This program involved promoting local languages, appointing non-Europeans to positions of authority in the party and state apparatus within the national republics. They were also given preferential access to education and employment in certain industries. And this program has led historian Terry Martin to describe the Soviet Union as an affirmative action empire in this period. Now, the course of Korenizatsiya didn't always run smooth, as you can imagine. It was quite difficult in certain regions to find local people who were sort of technically qualified, well-versed in Marxism and Leninism, from the right class background, and with a decent level of Russian language to fill whatever position it was. That's quite a big ask. And also, the program met with, I think, quite predictable resistance from Russian workers who felt that Uzbeks were being given unfair advantage for no good reason. Especially when, if you're talking about sort of factory workers, of which there were some in the region, the Soviet state is claiming to speak for the proletariat, and so these Russian proletarian workers then feel like they're not being represented by the workers' state. In the cultural sphere, the Soviet government also promoted education in the Uzbek language, as well as supporting the newspaper and periodical press, the publication of literature in Uzbek, and translation of revolutionary Russian literature into Uzbek, as well as promoting what was vaguely called national art. It's a baggy category, but they established workshops for handicrafts and the visual arts, for example. And Kolonizatsiya in the cultural sphere like this, I think, can be construed as an attempt to identify the aspects of local culture that could be seen as supportive or at least neutral to the program of Sovietization, and then codify these as national traits, and so that it was possible to actively promote reforms in the name of the Uzbek nation and in the name of the Soviet state at the same time. What progress the authorities did make in the 1920s was achieved in collaboration with the reform-minded elites who were prominent voices in Uzbek society, and whose aims were really no less utopian than the Bolsheviks. The kind of professed aims were the banishment of backwardness, superstition, and illiberal traditions, the emancipation of women, the spread of literacy and education, and often national self-determination for the peoples of Central Asia. This group became known as the Jadids. They didn't really call themselves that at the time, but that's what they're known as now. And while their aims were not by any means in perfect alignment with Bolshevik policy, they nonetheless cooperated, the Jadids and the Soviet authorities, in the 1920s. The Jadids, on the one hand, saw Soviet power as an opportunity to push through their reforms that they'd been campaigning for and were unable to achieve under Tsarism. And the Soviets, on the other hand, really relying on Jadid authority and collaboration to achieve pretty much any level of organization and penetration into local society. Disrupting the status quo is one thing, but to do anything actually constructive, they needed all the help they could get in this period, essentially. From the Jadid's point of view, the most important reforms were in the sphere of education. They wanted to do away with the traditional Islamic schools and introduce new method schools. They wanted to improve literacy rates, which at this point were really low, to encourage girls and women into education, as well as ending the most oppressive practices regarding the treatment of women, such as polygamy, female seclusion, and child marriage, and the paying of bride price at weddings, which they argued effectively amounted to sort of buying wives. These were all aims of the Soviet government too, but there were inevitably conflicts over the scale and the methods of change. It's important, I think, to think of the Jadids as modernizers, not only within the context of Soviet state reforms, but also in the context of a broader reformist movement across much of the Islamic world in this period. Kemalist Turkey, as I mentioned earlier, is the most obvious example of a state that was actively pursuing the similar sorts of social reforms, and also asserting a sort of modern Islamic identity, and also operating, of course, it's worth noting, in the aftermath of a collapsed empire following the First World War. Iran and Afghanistan were also, though, promoting social reforms, especially regarding the role of women in society. And there was concern in the Soviet Union, both among the Jadids and the Soviet authorities, that the Soviet Union, allegedly the most progressive state in the world, was lagging behind its neighbours in this sphere. The modernisers in Turkestan, in the Jadids, largely considered themselves Islamic reformists. They were opposing female seclusion and the wearing of the veil, for example, on the grounds that they found no Quranic justification for it. And this sort of background didn't really sit very well with Soviet official atheism. By the late 1920s, the Jadid belief in the nation state as well led to accusations of sort of separatist nationalism and anti-Soviet agitation. And the Jadid movement was ultimately swallowed up in the whirlwind of Soviet economic and social change that happened in the late 1920s with the five-year plans. And also, I mean, in the period following that, many of its leading members ended up being arrested as saboteurs. That brings us to why I've chosen to focus on 1926 as a particular historical moment. Because in my opinion, it marks a really interesting tipping point in the balance of power between this sort of moderate reformism with its basis in Jadid thought and Soviet sort of full-on revolutionism that comes in afterwards. It wasn't really until 1926 that the Soviet state felt assured enough of its power in Uzbekistan to launch a full-scale political re-education program. But in 1926, that is what they did. So they hadn't really, it hadn't been a priority up until then, and it hadn't really been feasible, but 26 is the moment when it's launched. The aim was to entrench new habits of thought in the population, so that it would see politics in the categories and the vocabularies of the new regime. In the militaristic terminology that they favored at the time, they opened what was called an ideological front in Uzbekistan, which was essentially the first major propaganda and political education campaign in that region. That year saw a huge outpouring of new material, either specially written or specially translated. This included plays, pamphlets, school curricula, all sorts of reading material, really, as well as newspapers, magazines, everything for workers' clubs and Komsomol groups, as well as posters. This is what they called a red chaikhana being a sort of tea house, which was used they were established as locations for the undertaking of the propaganda campaign. So you would go there to listen to speeches and to consult this reading material if you could read it. The 1926 round of local elections, so selecting delegates to go to the local Soviets and ultimately to the Soviet nationalities, was accompanied by an agitprop campaign using these specially created or translated materials. And agitators traveled around the countryside significantly, so it goes beyond the urban centres, holding meetings, including separate meetings for women, and the whole thing was accompanied by a renewed literacy drive as well. Some of the main themes that were discussed by the agitators were the success of, or exaggerated success, of Soviet campaigns against the Basmachi, these rebel groups, and as well the promise of economic reconstruction and land reform and the redevelopment of cotton agriculture. So the state was really making its presence felt in the countryside in a way that it hadn't done before then. I want to take a little digression into some of the details of how the agitprop campaign was actually conducted on the ground, because some of the methods are quite odd. We have a surviving report, excitingly, by one of the propaganda workers. It was written in Russian. It's not signed, but we can assume it was a sort of a party member on a low level who wrote this report. It contains all sorts of fascinating details. So in the Samarkand region especially, they set up a load of these red chaikhanas. As I said, this being a sort of tea house meeting place, frequented exclusively by men, as you might gather from the picture. where people would come and listen to lectures and have Pravda read at them and that sort of thing. But according to the report, apparently they only had really horrible tea, and so they had to resort to bribing people with osh, which is a sort of rice dish, a bit like a biryani, to persuade them to come and listen to the speeches. In Khwarezm, which is a different region, they had an aeroplane for some reason and threw pamphlets and posters out of the aeroplane above the fields. And it was apparently very effective and had people sort of running after the posters to grab them from the plane. Generally speaking, the system of distributing posters, aeroplane aside, was really ineffective. And the propaganda workers are constantly complaining that the posters arrive late or they aren't displayed properly. And when they are displayed in the villages, they're always torn down, which is a really fascinating detail. And it's infuriating that obviously we don't have any there's no record of the reason behind this. But the report says that the peasants, local peasants, tear the posters down and take them back to their houses or to their yurts. There's no way of knowing really whether they conceived of this as some kind of protest, either against the images themselves or against the sort of political system or the propaganda campaign more generally. Don't know either whether they destroyed the posters or took them home to actually display them in their own houses. There is some implication that that's what some people were doing. A report from the Kashgar region complains with quite some irritation that even some of the people who were working as election officials didn't really seem to understand what was going on. They didn't seem to understand what the posters meant, and yet they kept stealing them and putting them up in their own houses. One person apparently had, quote, pasted up almost 25 posters of miscellaneous content in his own home. And the miscellaneous content thing really amuses me because it makes it sound like if only he'd organized them thematically, it would have been fine. But so there are some really interesting details of kind of how this campaign was actually conducted. And the campaign was a bit haphazard and not very well organized, but it did reach out to places in the Uzbek countryside with political messages from the central state, really for the first time on this scale. So it sort of, it acts, in terms of accessing people, it got to people in a way that it hadn't before. The extent to which they understood the political messages is debatable. So what were the messages that the campaign had hoped to convey? The three main themes that I want to consider today in relation to the posters are nation, class, and the position of women. To begin with, we'll click.
You'll have to look forward twice now. It's a slight delay.
Okay. Well, we'll see if it does. Okay, perfect. So to begin with the theme of national identity, which I've already discussed, but this poster very clearly, unusually clearly, depicts the Soviet nation according to the Marxist definition of nationality, or strictly speaking, the Marxist-Leninist definition, which is a historically constituted community of people, so it's historically contingent, and the product of economic conditions. The symbolism here is fairly crude. We have these 6 men, each representing one of the national republics, of which there were only 6 at this point, gathered around the central flagpole, with the banner of the Soviet Union, the red banner flying from the top, and the base of the pole in an anvil, which was a really common symbol for proletarian labor in this period, even more common, I think, than the hammer of the hammer and sickle, as a kind of a symbol of labor. And so we have the glory of the Soviet Union rooted in labor and supported by the brotherly cooperation of the nations. They've each got one hand holding up the flagpole. What's interesting, I think, is that each nationality is encoded both as a human figure, male figure, I'll say, and a landscape. It's both. So we see nationality as embodied by a person in their facial features, in their hair, and their clothing, but it's also mapped onto this this Marxist understanding of nationality as the product of living conditions and the stage of economic development of a particular group of people. These emblematic landscapes are arranged in these 6 equal sections, as you can see, radiating out like the spokes of a wheel and completely detached from anything resembling a realistic geography. So they're not arranged east to west or anything like that. There's a clear emphasis here then, I think, on agricultural activity and industrial development as markers of nationality, and also compositionally on the harmonious cooperation between the peoples and their equality with one another. It's worth noting that the sections representing the Republic are equal in size, but also the more backward, to use contemporary terminology, so the nations were classed into more backward and more developed, and so the more backward nations are at the front, they're prioritized, and the more developed are put behind. The report from the election campaign that I mentioned actually discusses the reception of this poster, and it prioritizes the economic aspect. So it claims that when this poster was shown to peasants in Samarkand, or the Samarkand region, quote, the peasants gather round the posters in groups. They examine them and try to get to grips with everything. Seeing a person in national costume with cotton fields nearby, they say, that is an Uzbek because he is by the cotton fields. When they look and see yurts, camels and sheep, they understand that it's a Kyrgyz or a Turkmen. When they see a lot of forest, good buildings and factories, they understand that that is Russia. What the viewers really thought is not necessarily accurately reported, but the report writer is emphasizing this idea that the Uzbek peasants are developing an understanding of nationality according to the Soviet definition. There isn't really any discussion of national consciousness. There's no sense that the viewers identify themselves with any of the figures depicted here, but rather that the idea of nationality, and specifically nationality contingent on economic conditions, is beginning to take root. And this poster is an early example of what would later, especially in the Stalin era, become a really standard trope, which was the friendship of the peoples, the harmonious relations between the different nationalities, united around the central foundation of the Soviet state. And here it's depicted symbolically. Later in the 30s, the Soviet state is kind of embodied by Stalin most commonly. Several posters, such as this one as well, therefore emphasize harmonious relationships between the nationalities and condemn inter-ethnic conflict. In so doing, obviously, they imply that the state of relations in reality was less than perfect, which was the case. There are documented clashes between Russians and non-Russian groups in Uzbekistan well into the 30s, and sometimes these sort of huge semi-organized brawls in which hundreds of people took part, often on kind of industrial sites and railway buildings and things. The propaganda at the time really tried to emphasize this idea of inter-ethnic harmony. And we can see here, as in the previous example, the use of textiles and dress to denote nationality. The European, presumably a Russian, he's depicted in the sort of absolutely standard way for depicting a Russian worker in the 1920s. You can see it in hundreds of Soviet posters. He's got the Russian-style shirt in Bolshevik red, the big black leather boots of an industrial worker. He's neither particularly old nor particularly young, as opposed to Russian peasants who are almost always depicted as an old man with a great big beard. And we can see, I think, that the artist has sort of tried to culk that into Uzbek, as it were. The same stride, the same facial expression, they're both holding up the same banner. But the second figure is marked as non-Russian in his skin and hair color, but also in his clothing. The Russian shirt has been replaced by a striped chapan, although not one in such sort of decorative fabric as to imply that he's wealthy. And he's wearing the dopa, which is an embroidered square hat that was quite common across the region, and was considered sort of traditional dress for men. The men in the Trakana photo, you would have seen them wearing the same kind of hat. It's interesting, I think, that this is the only poster from the whole set from this year where the slogan is in Russian only, it's not in Uzbek. And this is the one that most clearly emphasizes sort of friendly relations between Russian and Uzbek groups. It suggests to me that it's aimed at a Russian audience, and specifically at making Russian workers see these Uzbek farmers as comrades in the same struggle. Other posters, while not focusing on nationality as such, specifically call on Uzbeks as a group to strengthen their republic, either militarily or in agricultural or industrial production. This example calls on those who wish to labor peacefully to come to the defense of the republic, whose borders are marked out by this thick red line. So that line there signifies the border of the Uzbek Republic. In a manner that was usually used for the international borders of the Soviet Union. It's quite unusual to get a depiction of internal borders like this. The field of activity within the borders emphasizes the types of agriculture that were most readily associated with Uzbekistan. So the irrigation ditches, cotton, which is what's going down by his foot there, and fruits that to a Russian audience would be considered exotic fruits, such as grapes and melons, which is the woman that has grapes. The futuristically industrial landscape up at the top is somewhat exaggerated. We kind of look at the actual level of industrial development in this period. And it only contains sort of small hints of connectivity with the Soviet Union as a whole. There's a radio mast and a tiny aeroplane at the top, and that's the only kind of implication that there's that the Uzbek Republic is part of a wider network of this sort of integrated wider union. And it's quite surprising because a lot of the other propaganda images of this period really have a focus on sort of the electrification of the whole Soviet Union, the building of railways. This sort of connectivity is a big theme, and it's really minimized here. So the Uzbek Republic is visualized here as a delimited space, and the slogan specifically refers to the Uzbek section of the Red Army and the defense of the Republic, not the defense of the Soviet Union. So there were a number of ways that poster artists engaged with the idea of the Uzbek nation, not necessarily focusing on its integration with the Soviet Union as a whole, but quite often emphasizing both the importance of nationality as a category and also friendly, peaceful relations between the Soviet nations. I'd like to move on to talk a bit about class as my second theme, because of course for the Bolsheviks, an understanding of class struggle underpinned everything that they were trying to achieve. But they found it quite difficult to map their ideas about class onto Central Asian society, which was sort of defined in Marxist terms as feudal or semi-feudal. And most notably, there wasn't much of an urban proletariat, for the simple reason that it wasn't very highly industrially developed, so there just weren't many factories for a proletariat to work in. Those that existed were very often worked by Europeans in Tashkent, in Europeans, mostly Russians. So in sort of propaganda terms, reconciling the glorification of the proletariat with the narrative of the oppressed Uzbek nation is quite tricky. And the solution, or the attempt at a solution, was that much as in the Russian countryside, they divided the peasantry into three classes. You're probably familiar with the term kulak, which is a sort of rich or landowning peasant, followed by serednyak and bidnyak, sort of medium and poor peasants. They attempted something very similar in Uzbekistan and came up with this, which is presented as a sort of handy visual guide to the correct people to vote for in the election. From left to right, we have a batrak, who is a landless and possibly itinerant farm laborer, the poorest of the lot. Next, there's what is labeled as a working woman. There were not very many working women in Uzbekistan at this point, but that's what she is described as. In the middle is just a worker. He has the apron and the hammer of a blacksmith, which interestingly are borrowed from Russian iconography of the worker. which even has its roots in sort of pre-revolutionary socialist imagery. The blacksmith is the sort of used as cynic joke for the proletariat. And then we have a poor peasant and a middling peasant. This is an obvious but not, I think, very successful attempt to categorize Uzbek society in class terms. It's unsuccessful on one level because apart from having progressively less tatty clothes from left to right, there's no real distinction between the three classes of peasant, and very little sense of what belonging to these classes really means. Like, what kind of person is a poor peasant versus a middle peasant? And then, as I sort of hinted at, there's the issue of the female figure who's labelled as a working woman, but very little sense of what this means in a society where women very rarely work outside of the home. And we'll come back to the question of the role of women later. But as a sort of categorization of society in class terms, it's a bit vague. So if the image of the positive class heroes is a bit confused, the image of the class enemies is much clearer. So as well as posters of indicating who you should vote for into the Soviets, there were other posters illustrating who you should not allow even to come to the elections. These are two very similar images, obviously on a visual level, just as you can see. They've got this larger-than-life giant of a worker without the robe that the earlier one was wearing, but still wearing both of them the doppler hat. And they're physically shooing the class enemies away. There's sort of, the use of black is really interesting here as well. There's sort of idea that you cast into the darkness. And the building that this one is sort of cradling protectively is labeled the Soviets. And these class enemies consist of the bai, or wealthy landowner, which is the top left in that example, and this fat person here with this turban askew. The merchant, the kulak, and the ishan, which is used as a sort of catch-all term for any religious figure. This poster omits the kulak, but keeps the landowner, the merchant, and the ishan rejected from the Soviet. And the tropes of the enemies, these enemies of the people, are drawn from satirical cartoons. And they're quite sort of standardized images. There's the wealthy landowner who is always depicted in quite rich clothing and always depicted as very fat, as a sort of shorthand for wealth and, I guess, idleness. There's the effete, sort of slightly Europeanized merchant. He's wearing, this one wears a European waistcoat. And then the elderly bearded ishan or mullah. These are, as I said, they're all drawn from satirical imagery. And they're all made sort of ridiculous by their grotesque facial expressions and the fact that they're always sort of being flung into the abyss, losing hats and shoes. It's always this sort of chaotic imagery. And it is supposed to be funny, I think. These are intended to provoke laughter and ridicule. The central section of this image is really similar, again, with the same cast of class enemies being thrown into the bottomless pit. But the overall composition of this image is really unusual. It's very decorative, and it seems to be drawing on some of the calligraphic posters that were circulated in Turkic-speaking territories before the revolution, with these coloured bands going up the sides like this towards a sort of central focal point. Just for comparison, that's a calligraphic poster that was printed in Kazan in 1902. And you can see the visual parallels. So I think if we return briefly to the question of national identity and national art, I think there's an attempt here to sort of translate some of the visual traditions of Muslims of the Russian Empire, in this case not a specifically Central Asian tradition, but one that was came from Tatarstan before the revolution, sort of translate it into a Soviet idiom. It also gives us a very decorative representation of the union of industry and agriculture. That's what's going on at the top. We've got wagon and camel roads of probably cotton, but of agricultural products going from right to left, from village to city, and then a procession of trucks and tractors going the other direction, and again an aeroplane, just as a sort of nod to modernity. And that imagery that goes across the top is really typical for Soviet posters as a whole in this period, so ones printed in Russia as well. This representation of what was called the smychka, so the bond between peasant and proletariat, between agriculture and industry. And it's drawn directly from the model of posters from Russia. So this is a sort of hybrid image, I think. It's an attempt to combine some different visual traditions to make something that would be legible, I think, to local, or what the artist hoped would be legible. What is less usual is that we've got a completely gender-segregated society along the bottom. So we've got men walking up the stairs to the left and women to the right under the banner of "Open a broad path to women at the Soviet elections." And this brings us to my final theme, which is the role of women, or what was known as the woman question at the time. So, as I mentioned earlier, the emancipation and education of women had been a major aim of the Jadid movement. They'd focused their efforts on condemning female seclusion, child marriage, polygamy, and bride price, as well as promoting women's education. They did this on the grounds that A, none of these practices was demanded by the Quran or the Hadith, so they saw it as a corruption of Islam. But also in sort of nationalist grounds, it's for the good of the nation's future that, for example, mothers should be literate so that they can educate their children better. They also sometimes recommended unveiling, but this wasn't really a major focus for them. So women in Uzbekistan in this period, especially urban wealthy women, often, but not always, not all of them, wore a two-part veil when they went outside their homes. It consisted of a paranji, which goes on top of the head and kind of hangs down the shoulders and the back, and a chashvan, which is made of horsehair and sort of mesh that goes over the face. We can actually go back a couple of images. This one. So the blue robe that she has over her head is the paranji, and then the black thing on her head is actually a chashvan, which she has pushed back. She's kind of lifted up from her face. And if we look in this image, the women are actually wearing various head and face coverings. So some of them are in the full chashvan and paranji. Some of them have pushed the veil back over their head, as in the previous example, and only one woman, the one right at the top, has her hair completely uncovered. Now, I mentioned the veil because it later became the main emblem of the Soviet liberation of the Eastern woman. And by extension, the Soviet liberation of the oppressed peoples of the East in that narrative. It's formed a really central part of the narrative in which casting off the veil, unveiling as an act is emblematic of enlightenment, the moment when a female subject, and by extension the whole of sort of the East, is liberated and enters into the socialist world. Obviously, you don't need me to point out the Orientalist overtones in this narrative, but what is really interesting is the centrality of the veil and the act of unveiling in later images, I think, is so much to do with the fact that it is visual, it's about visibility. If you're looking for a visual metaphor for liberation and enlightenment, looking at it with a European eye, you can't get much more sort of dramatic than the lifting of the veil. Making these women literally visible in Soviet society for the first time. The theatricality of the act of unveiling was recognized at the time too, with ceremonial public mass unveilings and burning veils in squares in Tashkent and things. Often organized on International Women's Day, but that happened later. I'm going to be slightly ahead of myself, because that program of unveiling was inaugurated in 1927. And the Soviet state launched an official attack or assault on the practice of veil wearing. So what we have in these images from the previous year, I think, is still rooted in the Jadid idea that unveiling is embedded in a bigger issue surrounding women's education, and that actually focusing on the veil, powerful though it is as a symbol, is actually a distraction from the cause of women's emancipation in real life. There's only one sort of exception amongst the posters produced in 1926, where the image of the veil takes center stage. Because we saw in the previous image, it doesn't seem to matter a great deal what women are wearing as long as they're participating in the election. But this one, my final image of the day, which you've probably already seen on the poster for this talk, depicting the emancipated Uzbek woman. It's a very simple poster, but I actually think it's one of the most effective, or at least the most sort of visually striking of the collection. The pose of the female figure in the foreground cuts across the four veiled women behind her. That's what they are. They are figures of four women wearing the chashmat and paranji. And they're actually gradually emerging from the darkness from left to right, and you can sort of almost see the face of this one on the far right. Obviously, this woman in the front is unveiled, and she has actually replaced her paranji with the red headscarf of the Russian Soviet worker. There were accusations at the time that to remove the paranji was an act of Russifying oneself, to become Europeanized, and that was not, generally speaking, meant as a compliment to a modest Uzbek woman. And it actually, when that campaign, the unveiling campaign, was inaugurated in 1927, it actually kicked off a huge backlash, and there was a huge amount of violence against women who went out without the veil. So it was a very contentious issue. But actually, I feel like the act of unveiling is not really the focus here in the way that it would later be. The symbolism of emerging from the darkness into the light is clearly present in these background figures, but I don't really think that this poster is actually arguing that in order to participate in public life, you must cast off the veil. It's actually that participation in the election, participation in the Soviet state, that is the focus here. So I think it's possible to see this as almost a transitional image between the Jadid focus on ending women's seclusion and bringing them into public life, as well as the Soviet emphasis on mobilization and public participation as the marker of the socialist subject, before it evolved into the very heavy-handed unveiling equals freedom images that were published later, especially during the 5-year plan. So, to conclude, I should point out that while most of the artists who designed these posters are unknown, the posters are mostly unsigned, it's highly likely that they were almost all Russians. Although some of them, like Maria Nesterova, who did sign the image we saw earlier, may have been born in Turkestan. She was born in Samarkand. The records we have from publishing houses and the memoirs of artists who were active at the time suggest that during the 1920s, there were very few so-called nationals, i.e. non-Russians, working in the propaganda network. I've only really come across one from this period, who's a man called Usta Nabi Khafizov, who was working in Bukhara when Bukhara was the People's Republic of Bukhara. But there's one very bad reproduction of one of his posters, is all that I found, and he then vanishes from the record. So I think we can safely assume that there were very few Uzbek artists working in propaganda in this period. It's certainly changed later on. So largely, we're looking at a vision of Soviet Uzbekistan as imagined by Russian artists working in the region. However, because of the politics of the time and the need to promote Uzbek national culture, it's a consciously un-Russian image. Russianness is almost completely absent here as a sort of national category. And there are clear attempts to draw on local visual culture to visualize Soviet ideals in an idiom that they thought would be comprehensible to local people, and most significantly, to interact with pre-existing discourses of modernization and nation. And just as a footnote, really, the 1926 ideological front and agitprop campaign, even according to the officials who conducted it, was not very successful. Apart from the logistical issues I mentioned earlier, they wrote that people didn't really understand, people in the provinces this is, didn't really understand what they were trying to do. Peasants, unsurprisingly, had very low levels of national or political consciousness at all, let alone a decent grasp of Marxism. I mean, why they would is, it's unlikely, but the party officials were quite distressed by this. And generally, the whole exercise left the party officials frustrated. And I believe that this frustration contributed to the party's shift in 1927 to a much more radical policy in Uzbekistan. The real kind of aggressive attempt to stamp out cultural backwardness, as they called it, and a much more decisive period of Sovietization and socialist construction that would lead to more dramatic and lasting changes in the region.
Okay. Questions?
Yeah, sure. I think I have a question. The first one, methodological. So how are all the images that you have here, these are all the ones that you found, or how are you selecting the images that form part of your study, and where you can find those? And then my second question was more to do with this question about how the images are produced, and the very few non-Russians that are producing these. But presumably there's some kind of contact there with local Uzbek to be able to kind of represent them. I was just wondering how. So are these Russian? Would they have spent a long time in Uzbekistan? But before creating the images, are they working in tandem with locals? How are those images of what these different peasant classes are? How are the Russians getting those impressions?
Okay.
Yeah. So
Do you want one more?
Sure.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was just wondering, because you said you just focused on like 3 themes today, and I was just wondering what other themes you're looking at. And I was just wondering, what role race plays, just because the one picture we had where they were all holding this like flag together, and it just seemed like skin color had a important connotation. Or just how you would that.
Okay, sure. So, in terms of how, methodology and the images I'm selecting, the ones that I've chosen today are all from this specific campaign. So they're really from a discrete group of images that were published either in Samarkand or Tashkent all in the same year. And they are currently, there's a copy of them in one discrete collection in an archive in Moscow. So they're sort of, they constitute a complete campaign. So I've just selected from that group. But more broadly, my project goes from 1920 up until 1940, and so there are lots of publishing centres in that period. Some in, so lots of posters for Central Asia are published in Kazan and Moscow and Petersburg or Leningrad, as well as in Tashkent and Samarkand. So sort of filtering out the ones meant for different audiences means relying on the language that the slogans are in a lot. And also sometimes the kind of the way that they're addressed, so sometimes it's addressing the people of the East as a sort of generic category. And I've been selecting them essentially or organizing them thematically, because I think that's the most interesting way to do it, to trace how these different themes develop and how the different tropes and motifs, visual motifs, develop throughout the period. In terms of the artists and who is producing the images, it varies massively. So when I'm talking about Russian artists, it's most commonly ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking people who were born in and living in Central Asia. So, of which there were quite a few, because I mean, I said it was sparsely populated, but there were quite a few Russian colonies, or sort of there was a decently sized Russian population. And so Maria Nesterova, who's the example we looked at today, but quite a few other artists as well, were from Russian families but had been brought up in Central Asia. Also, though, there was a concerted campaign by the central government in Moscow to send Russian artists to Central Asia to essentially teach them about art, to raise the cultural level of the backward regions, to set up art schools, to promote artistic education. And so there are quite a few artists who actually get sort of posted to Central Asia by the state propaganda campaign, by Narkompros, the sort of education department, as an official posting. And some of their biographies are really interesting. There's one guy called Alexander Nikolaev, who exactly this happens. He's an artist, and he gets posted to initially Tashkent, I think, and then to Samarkand. And he kind of basically attempts to become an Uzbek person. He converts to Islam. He takes an Uzbek name. He calls himself Ustomumin for the rest of his career, and kind of embraces that aspect of life, or attempts to sort of identify himself as an Uzbek person in Central Asia, which is really interesting, I think, as a choice for him to make, especially converting to Islam, considering the anti-religious campaigns. There were other artists, there were some Russian artists who were based in Moscow, who were creating posters in Moscow and who had never been to Central Asia and didn't know anything about it. So there's quite a wide range in terms of actual knowledge of local culture. Some of them, it's worth noting also that even the Russians who've been born and brought up in Turkestan quite rarely spoke the local languages to any decent degree. And so there's a huge amount of reliance on mediators and translators who are either from this Jadid group of intellectuals because they're well enough educated to do the translation, or they're Tatars. And the role of Tatar people in education and sort of the administration in Uzbekistan in the early years is huge. Even before the revolution, there were lots of them, and crucially, they were very fluent in Russian, which a lot of people in Central Asia were not. And so they acted as mediators as well. So this is kind of, there are a lot of layers of filter through which these kind of cultural connections are passed. And as I sort of hinted later on, there are local artists who are then trained in European-style art schools, which are set up. And sometimes they even get sent to Moscow or Vitebsk or wherever else to train there as well. But then that's sort of late enough on that they then become sort of socialist realist artists, and that's the genre in which they are trained. So to your question about other themes, the themes I picked up today are probably the main ones generally. This idea of nationality I'm really fascinated by, but also class, because it was so important at the time, and the role of women, because it's so often what is focused on when the Russian sources talk about Central Asia. And they're sort of obsessed with this idea of the Eastern woman being oppressed and how she could be this emblem, the emancipation of the Muslim woman could be this emblem of liberation. So those are the main ones that I'm looking at, but there's also, when it comes to the 5-year plan, there's a huge explosion of imagery about collectivization of agriculture and industry and the industrial aesthetic also being a major obsession for Soviet culture in this period. And also anti-religious campaigns are really interesting, I think. We sort of hint of it in the images of the Ishan as a class enemy, but there are more images that are anti-religious, and there are a parallel to the anti-religious, anti-orthodox imagery in Russia. But there are some really fascinating posters condemning fasting for Ramadan, for example, because it means that you're a weak worker. If you haven't eaten, you can't work properly in the day. It's inefficient. And supporting, trying to persuade people to take their children out of Islamic schools and send them to Soviet schools, because that was actually a choice that people were allowed to make. Islamic schools continued to operate, largely because they didn't have enough teachers to run a whole nation's worth of Soviet schools immediately. And so there's a lot of, there's quite a big emphasis on kind of casting away superstition and archaic beliefs and archaic practices as well, kind of health and hygiene type practices even, that were rooted in sort of folk beliefs or traditional beliefs that the Soviet state was also trying to do away with. Which, I mean, it really, if nothing else, reveals the extent to which it was committed to getting involved in every aspect of the lives of its subjects. You know, when it's telling you how to wash yourself and to feed your baby and that kind of thing. Oh, and then you asked about race. So the Soviets' conception of race was really consciously defined in opposition to sort of the racialized discourses that were going on in Europe at the time, especially by the late 20s, early 30s. They were consciously contrasting their concept of race with the Nazi concept of race, and how it shouldn't be a sort of essentialized category. But it's not very clearly defined, and it overlaps with nationality a great deal. They're very cautious about categorizing people on the basis of race as opposed to nationality. They kind of feel like nationality is a safer category and a more scientific, objective category, which are also concepts that the Soviet discourse is interested in. But then later on, nationality does kind of get essentialized, and it becomes what has been described as an ascribed category. So once you have to write in your passport that I am this nationality, and once that categorization gives you preferential access to stuff, it becomes a sort of inherent part of your identity in a way that contradicts this earlier Marxist-Leninist concept that I was talking about, with nationality and economic development being one and the same. So it changes over the period.
I'm quite interested in what I do in like old Soviet, or old women in the early Soviet Union. So I was wondering, in the sense of just out of interest, in the sense that there was this sort of emphasis on this castle level superstition, and you know the old practices of midwifery in the Russian context and so forth, but also the liberation of women, which was kind of seems to be, it was constructed in a really much more radical sense than in the Russian context in a way, and that there was already sort of this industrial workforce of women reasonably substantial in the Russian Soviet Union. So I was wondering where old women figure in this imagery.
Old women, when they do figure in this imagery, which is not very often, tend to be just sort of representative of backwardness, really, of anti-modernity. There's, I'm now going to forget the term for it, but there was a sort of, essentially like a local teacher. So the education of girls was previously conducted sort of in people's private homes, but there might be a local woman who would teach them to read, for example. But they were roundly condemned, these women, as perpetuating these ideas of backwardness and superstitions and of religion, essentially. Much of the learning that went on in those schools was essentially rote learning of religious texts. There wasn't a huge amount else taught by them. And so where old women do feature, it's generally in a very negative way. And almost always, when we see the unveiled, the liberated woman, she is young. And actually it kind of fits the demographics of the people who were working with the Soviet movement at that time and the Zhenotdel, the sort of women's division. It had much more success with young women than with older ones, partially because they tended to have success with women who were sort of marginalized anyway. So either, they'd run away from home for whatever reason, or they'd been widowed at a young age, which happened quite a lot in the society with several wives, or like for whatever reason they were marginalized and they were often young and kind of looking for someone to help. And the Zhenotdel, the women's division, had a lot more success with those women than with women who kind of, not to say didn't need their help, but were in a different social position, a stronger social position.
I can't think of it.
Okay.
Maybe later.
When you were saying about the posters being torn down and all that,
Yeah.
otherwise, were there any surviving like vandalised? Were they being vandalised? Or?
That's really interesting. I
just
haven't
wondered
seen
if
one.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps they wouldn't survive, but I'm just wondering.
They are, and the posters that survive tend to be ones that have been archived at the time.
Okay.
So either a museum or a library or the party archives kept a copy of all the posters they were using. And so vandalized images are not going to make their way into that kind of archive. It would be really interesting to see if some have survived, but I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it seems very much that people took them, put them in their homes and kind of kept them.
Yeah.
They were treasured items. They weren't signs of resistance. And that kind of thing.
Do you think that's a display? That's what I wanted to know. Perhaps is that like an attempt to kind of look more sort of faithful?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're
That's
kind of
possible.
speculating, aren't we?
Yeah. I do wonder also whether it is on some level just purely decorative.
Yeah.
Like they're colourful
Yeah,
and people
striking,
wanted
yeah,
them on their wall.
And
And they're free. Yeah.
That is true.
Which in itself would have really disgruntled the Soviet authorities, because they're not supposed to be purely decorative. They're, a weapon of agitation. But if people want to put them on their wall, then all the better, I guess.
I guess I had a similar question just about reception in general, because it's always so hard.
Yeah.
But I really liked how you tried to peel it out of like the comments what day they would the posters, or I don't know if you have any other ways of kind of getting to that. Or?
Yes and no. So you can get at reception in a way that's very filtered. So the people producing the posters were really interested in reception, actually, because they wanted to know that their message had got across, and they wanted to know that people had got it, that they'd got the right message. So actually they conducted surveys and they asked people whether they liked the posters, and they observed their reactions, as in the quote that I read. They're taking notes while people are looking at the posters of what they're discussing. So those documents do exist, but obviously those are filtered through the propagandists and the people who are actually spreading these images, and so it's really hard to know what they're leaving out of those accounts. Other than that, you kind of can't access reception in a reliable or useful way, which is a great shame. It would be really interesting to know, but it's just not there.
Like, I haven't looked in great detail into any of the archives or any of the sort of monitoring of the mood type stuff, but I did find just any repository of like letters transfer that been forwarded. So I don't know if they would keep any like defense posting their they would just
Oh,
destroy them
possibly.
as like a way of saying this didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Because it could.
Mm.
Yeah, I guess.
I was also wondering, is like, you said they set up like workshops or schools,
Mm.
like in the region. I don't know if the images they produce look completely different. So, I don't know if this is just impossible.
It's the sort of accepted style or acceptable styles for Soviet poster art had shifted by the time those schools had kind of produced any graduates and kind of actually started printing anything. So there are a few examples from sort of around 1930 that are very constructivist 5-year plan. I don't know how familiar you are with Soviet posters, but like lots of diagonals and some use of photo montage and sort of monumental tractors and things ploughing up the land. They're very sort of dramatic constructivist imagery. Some of those are created by graduates of the local schools, but it's by that stage they're sort of not really negotiating over the style of imagery anymore. It's become much more centralized and more homogenized. And then especially even much more so in the 1930s, by the time real socialist realism, whatever that means, becomes really entrenched as a genre. By that stage, all of the images produced anywhere in the Soviet Union are basically the same. Like, apart from the language that the slogans are in, you can't tell where they're from. And very often, I sort of mentioned this idea of the friendship of the peoples. They very often have a kind of plethora, like a representation of all of the nationalities gathered around Stalin, that kind of thing. But then the same image is distributed everywhere.
When we were chatting earlier before the talk began, you were saying about not being able to get into some archives in Uzbekistan.
Yes.
Did you? Is it a matter of that you don't know what's in there at all until you get there, or do you are there things in there that you know you want to see? Okay. I just wondered what they were, and whether they might change the observation. Or confirm.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they would. And obviously the main difference is that the Central State Archive in Moscow has almost everything is in Russian. And so all of the sources are written, like the OGPU, the secret police reports and all of that stuff, as well as the propagandist reports and the Narkompress and everything is written in Russian. And even some of the they have these big conventions, like of all of the nationalities sent delegates. And sometimes, really infuriatingly, clearly the person taking notes couldn't understand anything that wasn't in Russian, so just left them out. It was just like brackets, Uzbek person speaks, and then carries on. So obviously there's a huge a lot of voices are absent from those records. And I would expect that there are a lot more Uzbek language materials available in the archives in Tashkent. And also that there are slightly different emphases in the stuff that's kept. So there are loads of the private archives of some of the artists that are kept in Tashkent, because a lot of them lived their whole lives and died there, and then their personal archives got taken over by the state. But yeah, as you said, due to bureaucratic complications, I haven't been allowed into archives in Uzbekistan yet.
Is that's just a delay, not like you might get into it? Or like,
it's an indefinite delay at this stage.
That's a shame.
It is a shame. It's a real shame. I'm doing my best to fill the gap with the periodical press, which was really very active. So a lot gets published in newspapers and magazines about all sorts of issues that are related to the topics. So I'm hoping that will help. But it's really difficult because you don't want to rely too much on Russian sources, or even just on sort of central Moscow sources, because obviously that leaves a huge part of the narrative out.
Can you bribe them?
I didn't try, but it might be worth a go.
I think when you offer the brand, I know someone that tried to bribe someone in Russia to get out very well.
Okay, really more sort of,
Yeah.
would you like
It's kind of
a
attractive. Okay, right.
How much do you want?
Hey.
Any more questions? Is there any remains to thank Molly? Thank you very much for fascinating paper.
Thank you very much.
Oh, and we're going to go for lunch. Dinner.
Oh.
Sorry, tea.
Yeah.
We're being northern about it somewhere. If anyone would like to come. Yeah. We're going to see. I was thinking over the showroom, because it's nice and close to the station.
When do you
Yeah, Izzy said it was quite busy when she trained last week. Yeah, we can do. It's not. I remember reading that. You're not a vegetarian, are you?
No.
Oh, just like check. Vegan?
No leading question.
I haven't checked yet, so I just thought this out
No,
that
I'm
mate.
easy.
I didn't know about the red leaves. So, well, that's true. I could have asked you, couldn't I?
Thanks, Molly.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Right, I need to pack away James's camera. And keep it tomorrow. Oh yeah, go on there. Yeah. Pack up.
I need to switch things off.
It's all right. I'll deal with it.
Okay.
You want to go to or something while we're waiting?
Sweet.
Just take a breather. Unfortunately, there's no. It'd be nice to offer you some water because I know you're getting dry. I always get dry when I speak.
Yeah, I've got water in my bag. I
Oh,
should have
that's
had it out.
There's a tap in, but no cups. So, there's one glass, but I'll rip off you a dirty glass.
Oh, thanks. All right.
Oh, God, I'm so tired.
Where did you get the contract?
James, who's been an absolute star,
Yes, we have.
organised it. I didn't think he'd be able to do it at such short notice, but he did.